Imagine arriving at a village where dinner was still cooking, tools were still lying on the floor, and the doors were still open. But every single person is gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, not even footprints in the snow. In the early 1930s, a trapper walked into a remote Arctic settlement and discovered something that shouldn't have been possible. An entire village that had simply vanished. Families, children, hunters, all gone overnight. What could scare an entire community so badly that they abandoned their homes without taking anything? And the deeper investigators looked into this case, the stranger the truth became. Night in the Arctic does strange things to silence. Out on the frozen edge of northern Canada, where the land meets a dark, unmoving lake called Anjikuni, sound travels differently. The wind carries it farther. The cold sharpens every noise, which is why the silence that morning felt so wrong. The man who noticed it first had traveled this route many times before. His name was Joe Labelle, a fur trapper who knew the northern wilderness better than most maps ever could. His journeys often took him across frozen lakes, through endless forests, and between isolated settlements where small communities survived by hunting, trapping, and fishing. One of those places was a quiet Inuit village near Lake Anjikuni. Labelle had visited it before. He knew what it should sound like: dogs barking, children running through the snow, the crackling of fires. But when he approached the settlement that winter day in the early 1930s, something immediately felt different. The silence stretched across the frozen ground like a warning. No smoke rising from chimneys, no voices, not even the restless barking of sled dogs. At first, Labelle assumed the villagers were out hunting. Entire groups sometimes left together to track caribou across the tundra. But as he walked deeper into the settlement, a strange feeling settled in his chest. The village didn't look temporarily empty. It looked abandoned. One of the first cabins he approached had its door slightly open. Inside, the air was cold, but not completely frozen. A cooking pot still hung over a fire pit, the ashes beneath it suggesting a fire had burned there recently. Nearby sat a half-finished meal, as if someone had been preparing food and simply walked away. Labelle stepped back outside and moved toward the next shelter, then the next. Everywhere he looked, the same unsettling pattern appeared. Tools left where they had been used, clothing folded neatly inside sleeping areas, personal belongings untouched, no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no damage, just absence. The village had once been home to around 24 Inuit residents, families who had lived along the shores of the lake for years, adapting to one of the harshest environments on Earth. Survival in that region required careful planning. Every tool mattered, every supply was precious, which made what Labelle was seeing deeply disturbing, because people who plan to leave the Arctic do not abandon their belongings, and yet the settlement looked as if life had simply stopped. Labelle called out into the empty air. No answer. He walked toward the shoreline of the lake, scanning the snow for signs of travel. In the Arctic, movement always leaves evidence. Footprints, sled tracks, something. But the frozen ground revealed nothing obvious, just wind-blown snow and long shadows stretching across the ice. The realization slowly settled in. Whatever had happened here had happened to everyone. Labelle didn't stay long. Something about the empty village made the air feel heavy, as if the place itself had become uncomfortable to stand in. He left and continued toward the nearest telegraph station, where he reported what he had seen. The story spread quickly. News of an abandoned settlement deep in the Canadian North traveled across telegraph lines and into newspaper offices hundreds of miles away. Within days, headlines began appearing. Entire Arctic village found deserted. Residents vanish without explanation. Homes left standing. No trace of people. For readers in distant cities, the story sounded almost unbelievable. A whole community disappearing overnight in one of the most remote regions on Earth. But the real mystery was only beginning. Because as reporters and investigators began piecing together the details, the story became stranger. Early reports claimed that when Labelle entered the village, cooking fires were still burning. Meals had been left unfinished. Sewing needles still sat in partially completed clothing. Some stories even claimed that sled dogs had been found tied to posts, starved after their owners disappeared. If those reports were true, the implications were chilling. It meant the villagers had not left calmly. Something had interrupted their normal lives. Something sudden, something urgent. Authorities attempted to investigate the case, but the region itself presented enormous challenges. Lake Anjikuni sat deep in northern Canada, far from major settlements, surrounded by vast stretches of wilderness. Travel was slow. Weather conditions could change rapidly. And in the Arctic, evidence does not last long. A strong wind can erase footprints within hours. A snowfall can bury tracks overnight. By the time anyone could reach the site to examine it carefully, many clues would already be gone. Still, the mystery captured public imagination. Speculation exploded. Some suggested the villagers had fled from an unknown threat. Others wondered whether disease or starvation had forced them to leave suddenly. But the most dramatic stories began appearing when newspapers started adding details that no one could verify. One version claimed the local graveyard had been disturbed. Another claimed mysterious lights had been seen in the sky around the time the villagers disappeared. With every retelling, the mystery grew darker. Soon the story had transformed into one of the most bizarre disappearance cases in North American folklore. An entire village gone without a trace. But as years passed, historians began asking an uncomfortable question. What if the story had changed along the way? To understand that possibility, researchers started examining the earliest reports available. They searched archives, old newspaper clippings, government records, personal journals, and what they discovered was surprising. Many of the most dramatic details that made the story famous did not appear in the earliest accounts. The first reports were far more cautious. They described a trapper arriving at an empty settlement. They mentioned uncertainty about where the villagers had gone, but they did not describe burning fires or starving sled dogs. Those elements appeared later, which suggested something important. The story may have grown more mysterious over time. In the early 20th century, newspapers often competed for readers by publishing dramatic stories from remote parts of the world. An empty village in the Arctic was already unusual, but adding strange details turned it into something unforgettable. And the more people repeated the story, the more those details solidified into accepted facts. But when historians looked deeper into Inuit traditions and migration patterns, a much more realistic explanation began to emerge. Communities in the Arctic rarely stayed in one place permanently. Their survival depended on movement. They followed caribou migrations. They relocated based on fishing conditions. They adapted quickly to changes in weather or food supply. Entire settlements sometimes moved together, leaving behind structures that were easier to rebuild than transport. If the hunting conditions near Lake Anjikuni suddenly changed, the villagers may have decided to relocate quickly to another area. And if they planned to return later, they might have left certain belongings behind. From the perspective of a traveler arriving days later, the village would appear abandoned. But in reality, it would simply be empty for the season. Still, one question remains difficult to answer. Why did the place feel so suddenly deserted? Why did the settlement appear as if life had been interrupted? The answer may lie in the harsh reality of Arctic survival. In that environment, decisions sometimes have to be made quickly. If food sources disappear, waiting too long can mean starvation. If ice conditions become dangerous, staying near a lake can become deadly. In such moments, leaders within a community might decide that everyone must move immediately. No delay, no hesitation. Just pack what you can carry and leave. If that happened near Lake Anjikuni, the departure might have taken place quietly in the night. Families gathering their essential tools, loading sleds, guiding dogs across the frozen landscape. leaving behind cabins that had once sheltered them through brutal winters. By morning, the village would be silent. And days later, when Joe Labelle arrived, he would find exactly what he reported, an empty settlement. But over time, that simple moment became something else. A legend. Today, the story is still told as one of the greatest mysteries of the Arctic, a place where an entire community vanished overnight. But the truth may be both simpler and more haunting. The villagers did not disappear. They moved on. They followed the path that survival demanded. And the silence Joe Labelle encountered that morning was not evidence of something supernatural. It was the quiet echo of a community that had already gone, leaving behind only empty homes, cold fire pits, and the frozen shoreline of Lake Anjikuni, where the wind still moves across the ice, exactly the same way it did on the morning the village was found empty.